Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. We've got Zed Jalani on. Some new comments from Disney regarding how they came to film Mulan in Xinjiang. Very interesting stuff there. We've got Jeremy Scahill on. The Intercept is digging deep into Biden's history as an empire politician, so we're going to talk to him about that project. But we wanted to start with 100 days of cable news covering Joe Biden.
That's right. Well, we had to recap Biden, but really we have to recap the powers that be. Let's put this up there on the screen from The Hill. Actually, TV news ratings and online readership plunge during Biden's first 100 days. That's weekly, full-day cable for CNN and MSNBC have been trending down. On average, 1.3 million household viewers watching MSNBC in the last week of January. For the week of April 25, that number was 868,000. At CNN, they went from 1.2 million to 750,000. Even Fox News is the same thing. And they even have a graphic. Let's put it up there on the screen. This really just visualizes how precipitous that drop has been. And just remember that Fox News may not have dropped as much in this same time period, but their drop was actually back in November during the election when they weren't willing to go along with Stop the Steal. So really you have a rosy picture here where everyone is tuning out cable news and reading less news. And frankly, I think that's a good thing relative to how people's mental health and general well-being will be in the future.
Yeah, well, and so, look, Trump rescued cable news. They were headed to oblivion before he came around.
And they knew it.
All freaking out about cord cutters. What are we going to do? Launching various failed streaming exercises, which they continue to do, by the way. And
How's
I think
Peacock doing?
Probably some of that panic is setting in once again. But not only that, I mean, Trump was obviously ratings bonanza, but this past year with coronavirus and with the Black Lives Matter protests and some of the violence and riots, and then you had January 6th. So you had this incredibly eventful, tumultuous year where many people were unable to leave their homes. So they had more time on their hands to be watching it. And some of those stories, coronavirus in particular, CNN and other news outlets were very well positioned. I mean, this is what cable news actually does well. Is when there's something breaking, they have the people on the ground, they can be there. You know, that was sort of like tuned everybody in. So now you have not only coronavirus is on the wane, people are getting vaccinated, you have Joe Biden in, and some of the numbers I've seen too about just how low the keyword search is, not only for him, but now that Trump is gone, people don't care about him as much anymore either. The Google search traffic for Trump has fallen back to the levels of before he even ran for president. That might be the part that surprises me the most. I sort of assumed that cable, because they would be in desperate straits like this, would really reach to capitalize on anything that he said, even if it's through his like annoying, weird press releases. But he's really been rather surprisingly quiet. So they haven't been able to make much of that either and are really kind of adrift right now.
No, it's really big. And what really drove this home was the Biden speech ratings. Put it up there on the screen. So it was only draws 26 million viewers, down from Trump, but not just down from Trump, down dramatically. And now some MAGA people were making a bit like, see, people tuned in for President Trump because they liked him so much. I'm like, no, it really was just that he was so polarizing. Even the people who hated him had to watch him. That was really what they drove home. And this is anecdotal, but like I was off and I was in Miami, and like I remember even when we were on vacation during the Trump years, if something was going on, somebody, they find out you're in DC, they're like, hey, what was going on with this thing? Or, you'd even be like, you couldn't even go into a goddamn coffee shop without CNN playing in the background and everybody just looking up at like this with Trump. The Biden speech happened, nothing was going on. People couldn't tell you anything about Joe Biden. And again, this is to the benefit, I believe, of Biden, because the longer that the country trends normal and that people are like, yeah, I guess the president spoke, like, I don't really know what's going on. I think that generally is to his benefit. It's also to the general benefit of if they're trying to move legislation, because it doesn't mean that it's going to enter like the culture war zeitgeist. And it really is just a total new paradigm shift. And we've noticed this too, which is that the new political is really cultural in terms of the stuff that people are watching. And cable just doesn't know how to deal with that. They dialed into an old failing business model and honed it for 5 years. And now with Trump, they have no idea what to do. I mean, they tried to make Dr. Seuss into a thing. That was gone. Like, what are they even talking about on Fox right now? I couldn't even tell you. And like, what is the current controversy? Did Biden pause like 27 times in his speech or something like that? Are they going to have some... Or I did hear that they're calling him a socialist over on Fox and Friends and saying that we really should have voted for Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, that we accidentally got Bernie Sanders as president.
I mean, what are these people doing over there? But they got to fill airtime. That's really what it is. So it's fascinating to see how the country shifted so dramatically. And it's because we're in extraordinary times. Trump was an extraordinary figure, and Corona was actually crazy. And now that it's all kind of receding, you're not going back necessarily, but you're entering something completely new.
They threw all in with being on one side or the other of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
You know, he polarized the country and he polarized media completely. So you had CNN and MSNBC, who created their entire business model during the Trump years, leaned way into just, we are going to be the Trump opposition. Fox News leaned in the polar opposite direction. And so now that he's gone, they kind of don't have a reason to exist anymore. Yeah. And while there's, you know, people keep saying, like, oh, the Biden era is boring, Biden's boring, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I honestly, doing this show every day, I find the current moment that we're living through to be fascinating.
Yes.
I find the political shift in dynamic to be fascinating. I find the trends that were surfaced and accelerated during coronavirus and what that's going to look like coming out of it to be absolutely fascinating. You all do too, judging by the way that you're, you know, tuning in to think about housing, to think about how this is all going to go and different shifts around the country in terms of people moving and what that's all going to look like, work habits changing, et cetera. But because these networks have for so long limited their range to such a narrow bandwidth and made their content so utterly like repetitive and predictable. And also, by the way, the big promise of the Biden administration, which I think they've delivered on, is basically like, you won't have to worry about politics every day. During the Trump era, watching cable news, for a lot of people, they convinced themselves this was like activism.
It's a proxy. Yeah.
That they were like doing something and that they were part of making the country a better place by tuning into these shows night after night. Well, now you got Biden in the White House, mission accomplished. You know, the bad guy's out, so we can go back to brunch, right?
I want to return to that because it's so important. I also think this is why we succeeded and are continuing to do incredibly well, even now during the Biden time, is because we never focused it just on Trump. We're like, hey, Trump came about because there's some crazy shit going on in this country. And, you know, it's like housing market. This is happening. People are freaking out about opioid. I mean, and we covered all of that and built the coverage. And frankly, there's intellectual interests around that. And so it doesn't change that much when Trump is gone. But for them, all the stuff that we would cover, they don't even know what you're talking about. Like with the housing market, they'd be like, wait, what's going on with housing? Or like they can relate it like to them. Or unless there's an explicit political angle, it's gone. It might as well not exist.
Yeah.
And that's not how people experience their lives. They don't experience their lives. They're like, hey, I tried to buy a house and I couldn't do it. Or like I tried, or my cousin, you know, suffered from this and I understand how this connects to my life. Or, you know, down here in South Texas, the way that we talk about race is totally different than the way that we see it represented in politics. Again, none of these are, if they even do get covered on cable, it's a 2-minute package in between some other bullshit around Russia or whatever. And so it's just, they're not optimized for it, and they never will be. That's the thing. It's not their business model. It's not what they know. It's not what they're good at. And that's why I think they're just going to continue to fail.
One of the most telling moments to me during the Trump era in terms of cable news was when the massive wave of teacher strikes was going on across the country.
And you're the only one who covered it.
And this was a massive shift. I mean, this was happening in red states. It was West Virginia. It was Kentucky. It was Arizona. And you had this massive labor mobilization, the likes of which we haven't seen in generations. And, you know, they would like do one story on it. But they really didn't know how to cover it or didn't want to cover it. Why? Because it didn't have a Trump angle.
Yeah.
He wasn't involved in it. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't polarize it. It was about, you know, these different states and what was happening with their budgets on the ground and working people coming together and saying enough is enough and we're going to take back power and we're going to make demands and make sure that public education is protected and that our pensions and the things that we were promised and our healthcare are protected. they really had no idea what to do with what was a fascinating story, again, unfolding in red states, places where you're told, people are just like Trump cultists and automatons, and there they are out in this massive working class solidarity movement. That to me was really telling that they've just completely shut their brains off. If it doesn't have a Trump angle, then it doesn't exist in cable news. And so now that he's gone, they really are kind of hosed.
Who's the most interesting man in the governor in the country right now? People talk a lot about Ron DeSantis. Look, he's fine, and he does. He's more of a national figure. Jim Justice is out there paying people $100 to get vaccinated, and he's a Republican who's blasting his Democratic senator for not spending enough money and blasting the Republican Party. But they don't know what to do with it. They're like, oh, that's weird. He doesn't sound like a normal.
Supposed to be just
West Virginia's supposed to be
Trump
right. There's supposed to be Trump people, but the Trump people don't align with Kevin McCarthy and what's going on with that. Their understanding of politics is so surface level and so unnuanced, and their inability in order to try and at least understand what's going on was fine during the Trump era, because you can just jump from story to story to story. People's eyes are glued no matter what was going on. But now that they've lost their golden goose, and as long as a Malaysian air pilot doesn't drive off into the sea, I don't know what they're going to do here. All right,
we're going to have our radars for you. That's next.